Where did the Democrats go wrong? Well, there are a lot of different areas where you can argue they went wrong, whether it be policy, messaging, strategy, rhetoric, all that stuff. The 2024 election has shined a light on some of the issues. Kamala Harris cannot be said to have run a perfect campaign. She was dealt a rough hand in terms of coming off of Biden stepping out of the primary. She got no votes in the primary, and that was something that conservatives used pretty aggressively as a cudgel against her, saying even that she might be a threat to democracy because she did not democratically earn the nomination. But why did she end up with the nomination? That's because Biden resigned, because he was not backed by the confidence of the Democratic Party, the Democratic elites. People were concerned about his debate performance in late June of 2024, which was seen as horrific, embarrassing, the worst debate in U.S. history, basically, with no close second anywhere in sight. So how did Joe Biden get the nomination to begin with? Well, he was basically the incumbent president, and the incumbent president basically just gets the nomination. That almost always has been the case. The party's going to back them. The voters are going to turn out for them. The whole name recognition thing, it works out. And how did he become the president? Well, he beat Trump in 2020 after his party nominated him over many other candidates. Many other candidates, including some who are older than him, like Bernie Sanders, and many who are younger than him, like Pete Buttigieg, Kamala Harris herself, Elizabeth Warren, Beto O'Rourke, Cory Booker, Julian Castro, Andrew Yang, Tom Steyer, even Tulsi Gabbard. This whole host of candidates who could have been the one to take on Trump, could have been the president that we have in office right now. And instead of them, there was the guy who seemed like the obvious choice, the former Democratic president's vice president. There's a lot we can say about the 2020 primary and how that all shook out, and especially in terms of how we compare it to 2016. I think that 2020 is similar to 2016, the 2020 Democratic primary and the 2016 Republican primary, that is, in that both parties chose a candidate who has the most baggage. 2016, they chose Donald Trump, a guy who's got sexual assault allegations, rape allegations, says whatever comes to his mind, has no filter, ended up becoming a convicted felon, unlike any of the other Republicans. And then in 2020, they nominate Joe Biden, a guy who has a past including voting for the Iraq War, who has made arguably racist statements in the past, like saying that he doesn't want his kids growing up in a racial jungle. That was back in the 1970s, but still, there are a bunch of other Democrats who don't have that baggage. And even as we come to find out, sexual assault allegations from someone named Tara Reade. He also had lied before quite heavily, kind of similar to Trump, how the Washington Post found Trump told over 30,000 lies in his first term. Well, go look at Joe Biden's PolitiFact profile. He has a very, very sketchy relationship with the truth. One of his most egregious lies that he told was when he claimed in February 2020 that he was arrested alongside Nelson Mandela in South Africa. They confirmed that was completely false. The ambassador who was there said, yeah, that never happened. So they basically just confirmed that this dude is just making stuff up. You probably didn't hear about that. But the Democratic Party nominated him anyhow because he's the guy with the institutional backing. I mean, he's Barack Obama's buddy, and Barack Obama is super cool, right? He's Obama's VP. Now, obviously, it was not simply the Democratic establishment who gave him the nomination. People have to go out and cast their votes for him. And that's what a majority of Democratic voters in 2020 did. I'd like you all to think, remember, where were you in winter 2020 with that Democratic primary? Because I remember very well Bernie Sanders wins the Nevada primary, and Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders had basically tied in the Iowa caucus. And yeah, it was looking like, okay, Biden's not going to win this thing. The guy who served as the vice president for the most recent Democratic president, the guy who seems like the obvious choice, who has the backing of the establishment, alongside several other candidates, the guy who's arguably one of the more conservative Democrats, including when he said nothing would fundamentally change under his presidency. This guy might not get the nomination. We might get someone younger or someone more progressive. Someone younger like Pete Buttigieg or someone more progressive referring to Bernie Sanders. Now, that didn't work out. You'll remember, at least I hope you do, if you're a political junkie, Super Tuesday 2020, Biden sweeps pretty heavily. It was shocking. There were higher hopes for Bernie Sanders for sure. This was after Biden winning South Carolina, as we all expected him to. He got the assistance of his good friend in the Democratic Party, Jim Clyburn. Biden ends up getting the nomination. Now, I heard some speculation. I mean, it's conjecture, but some progressives who support Bernie Sanders, who are very strongly opposed to Biden getting the nomination, who were talking about this whole process, and they said, who is actually showing up and voting for Joe Biden in this primary? We have other candidates. We have younger candidates. We have more progressive candidates. We have candidates who can speak more clearly and more coherently. Like, who's voting for this guy? And someone's pointed this out. They're like, the guy has deteriorated since 2016 and 2012. He wasn't as bad as he is now, but this guy struggles to string together sentences at times. Have the people who voted for him actually heard him speak since, say, 2016, since he was vice president? Did they just hear the name and they go, well, shoot, that's the guy that I need to go to the polls and vote for? How much research are they doing? Do they bother to listen to all the candidates? Do they watch the debates? Now, look, we talk about this all the time, but there are plenty of Republican voters who do so based on insufficient information. They vote Republican because they think it makes them feel good, and they heard the Republicans support lower taxes, and they want to keep more of their money. So they're like, oh, shoot, well, I'll vote Republican. And there are people like that on the Democratic side, too, who might not have that much information, who might say, oh, well, the former vice president, he was on Obama's ticket, and he won twice with Obama. So he surely will be the best candidate to defeat Donald Trump in November. And of course, he did defeat Donald Trump. He did. Good for him. He defeated him by 7 million votes. He then proceeded to, unfortunately, run again in 2024, get insider polling, he and his team did, that he would lose with 400 electoral votes for Trump in the election. And then he finally had to drop out of the race, making Kamala Harris look pretty bad, making the Democratic Party look pretty bad. I mean, Bob Casey, there were ads against Bob Casey, the senator from Pennsylvania, the Democratic senator who just lost, talking about how he knew about Biden's mental deterioration and just kept it hidden. Republicans can run some pretty effective ads at times. Biden, I mean, this is to say nothing about the policy that he accomplished in his presidency. I mean, he got so much accomplished that Republicans actually signed on to, too. Bipartisan infrastructure bill, CHIPS and Science Act. I mean, this is a guy with a good legislative record as president. And yet, even if he delivered on important policy areas, he hurt the party optically. He did. He made the Democratic Party look frail, look incompetent, look bumbling. And remember George W. Bush, how the media went after him for all his gaffes? I'm sorry, but Biden blows George W. Bush out of the water in terms of gaffes. Referring to Vice President Harris as Vice President Trump, referring to President Zelensky as President Putin, saying, "Where's Jackie?" referring to a congresswoman named Jackie who was dead. The guy has made a number of mistakes, just in terms of his speaking ability. And that sheer appearance alone, the optics of that, were enough to harm the perception of him of the general public. Now, this wasn't always the case. Remember that in 2021, Biden had his honeymoon period that lasted about 7 months, up until about the time he decided to withdraw from Afghanistan. I'm not going to get into that, but people approved of him. People liked more than half of Americans who were polled said they approved of him. And they knew he was old. They probably knew that he sometimes struggled to speak, struggled to coherently string together sentences, and they still approved him. Then, the years start to go by. The media obviously goes after him for pulling out of Afghanistan. Inflation ramps up. People feel the economic pressure, and public opinion of him drops tremendously, down to the 30s. And as people were pointing out in 2020, when was the last time a presidential candidate won with an approval rating in the 30s? It was Richard Nixon in 1968, and his opponent Hubert Humphrey actually had an approval rating even lower than that, the 20s. Trump's approval rating, bad as it may be, was not in the 20s. He was also in the 30s. There were red flags after red flags after red flags in Biden's candidacy for the presidency. Red flags all throughout 2023, 2024, saying this guy should not be the Democratic nominee. And the establishment, the Democratic institutions, the media ignored them. They ran with him. He's the most electable one, they said. The most electable one until he isn't. And I have no doubt that he would have done worse than Kamala Harris in this election. I think that if he had his speaking abilities that he did back in 2020 or 2019, if he had those and he was actually able to really effectively prosecute a case against Trump and defend his presidency, maybe he could have done better than Harris. Maybe he could have even won the election. But for crying out loud, the optics, the sheer optics of this, people just saw him as the incompetent old guy. And Harris's failure to distance herself from him didn't really help either. It's one of the areas where I think her campaign struggled and where I think she shot herself in the foot. But she doesn't want to go out there and diss Biden either, so I understand she had a tough balancing act. But for crying out loud, Democrats, I think this should be a lesson next time to not just roll with the person who seems like they deserve the nomination the most. Oh, they were the vice president before. Let's vet our candidates a little more. If there's red flags in the air, age, struggling to speak, inability to effectively use rhetoric, let's pay attention to those things. Let's vote accordingly. Vote for people who you can imagine doing really well 7 years from now. Did people in 2020 voting for Biden on Super Tuesday really see him in 2027 being the guy still fighting the good fight on behalf of the Democratic Party, speaking just as effectively as he was in 2019, 2020? I doubt it. I think it seems unreasonable for them to think that if they thought that. But I also sort of don't blame them, because Biden said he hinted he would be a transitional president, which suggests, hey, I'll be a one-term president. And he didn't end up wanting to do that. He wanted a second term, and he wanted it badly. He was defiant with the elite Democrats who wanted him to step down. So yeah, there's blame to go around. I sort of wish that voters had done a bit more research in the 2020 primary, because yeah, Biden's debate performances during the primary were pretty yikesy. They raised a lot of red flags. And I also don't know if he was the most progressive candidate they could have nominated. The Democratic Party and the American people generally are not like super right-wing, although not super left-wing either. But I would say they're to the left of Joe Biden, generally speaking. And yet they go with the guy who voted for the Iraq War, voted for the Defense of Marriage Act, said nothing would fundamentally change, has a history of kind of just being in general neoliberal. But that's to say nothing of what he got done as president, and I think he got some progressive accomplishments done as president. But yeah, be careful, Democrats. Next time, you got to be careful, really. Nominating the candidate with the most baggage might pay off for a guy like Donald Trump and the Republicans, but the Democratic Party is held to a different standard. The Democrats are expected to be the adults in the room, and when they can't do that, public opinion for them falls apart. It does. So yeah, these are just some thoughts that came up to me. If you found this interesting or insightful, please leave a like, comment, or subscribe to the channel. Let me know what you think, where the Democratic Party went wrong. There's obviously more things I could have talked about here, but yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to speaking to you in the next video.